Delays aside. All right, great. Hi, I'm Greg Stein, and like many of you, I'm really interested in this idea that robots are going to be expected to complete many different complex objectives in homes, buildings, etc. Everything from the rather mundane, things like load objects into the cabinet, to the more complex, and as we've been talking about on and off today, multimodal tasks that involve interaction with many different objects, things like the open-ended prepare breakfast, and the slightly more directed make the bed, restock the shelves, and then bring breakfast. However, a particular penchant of mine is planning under uncertainty. What happens when the robot is placed in an environment that's never seen before and in which it may not have a map and it must search for many of the task-relevant objects? Suddenly, most of these tasks that we were just talking about become quite a lot more complicated, especially because most classical approaches to task planning, like PDDL, typically assume full knowledge of the environment in one capacity or another. These tasks become a lot more complicated because now the robot must actually reason about parts of the environment that it cannot see in order to understand that the environment may have changed or that the robot may never have seen these parts of the environment, requiring that it search along the way to try to complete its objective. So to provide a little bit of context for this particular domain and problem set, let's look back at seeing what types of problems exist in this domain. There's the very simple approach of map, then plan. First, the robot explores and maps the entire world and then relies on known space planning to make good decisions once it's mapped the environment. The pros of this approach is that it's relatively simple if you're relying on some abstraction like PDDL or some way of representing the environment with skills that you believe are reliable. This is sound and complete, of course, sweeping under the rug the fact that there's a lot of perceptual capabilities, which is not what I'm here to talk about today. But the cons are that this can lead to somewhat arbitrarily poor performance. The robot has to map the entire world, which can include, well, basically everything, even though everything that it may need is right in front of it. So the somewhat better strategy is a commonly used approach, often referred to as optimism under uncertainty. This idea that the robot will explore nearby using either an uninformed or slightly more informed strategy for looking in nearby cabinets, counters, or containers for things that it needs, and then once it finds enough stuff that it thinks that it can complete the plan, it can again rely on known space planning with the parts of the world that it has added to what some refer to, inspired by George Kennadaris et al. Here, as their envelope of observability. Constantly growing what the robot knows in order to bring unobserved space into observed space and then try and make good decisions. Again, it's simple, it's sound and complete, but the cons are that even though it's slightly better, there's still generally possibly pretty poor performance as the robot is not making particularly good decisions about where it might look for these things and how to explore the unseen space to get what it needs. The challenge here is that, at least in the pre-deep learning, pre-foundation model eras, there's no real way to fill in missing knowledge, and so planning is still mostly uninformed. The solution to this, as you might have seen coming, is to use something like a learned model or a foundation model to help guide the robot towards good behavior. So let's take a look and go towards the, quote, other side of the equation, the very foundation model-driven approaches. Now, I know we've talked about a lot of things today that are better than this or different from this in one capacity or another, but to use say-can as a straw man, the way that something like say-can works is to propose reasonable next actions and then pick the action that is jointly doable with some affordance model and also makes progress towards the overall objective. This is great because it's powerful, it's flexible, it performs generally pretty well in practice, even though because you don't have a model, you're kind of sacrificing some of these completeness guarantees in general. But what's really interesting to me here, and the thing that I'm interested in talking about, is cost. What about performance? When we start thinking about these multimodal objectives, where the robot has many different ways that it can make progress towards the task, I find that a lot of these language model-driven approaches are somewhat lacking, something echoed by some of the things that Rao was talking about a little bit early today, and identified as a particular challenge area for some of the folks from physical intelligence. Say-can is ultimately fairly greedy, albeit with a very powerful heuristic about how to choose next actions. It's well suited to pick reasonable next actions rather than those that are necessarily best with respect to efficient or low expected cost solutions. LLMs are generally good at generating reasonable next candidate actions, but it's in general difficult for them to reason about which of these is best, that is most effective for allowing the robot to quickly make progress towards its complex, often multimodal or multi-objective objective. As such, using learned models or foundation models in this setting can result in some myopic performance, especially when we start thinking about long horizon tasks, even when they succeed at those tasks. The challenge inherent in something like the breakfast preparation task and others like it is that good behavior depends on many factors, including what objects the system believes exist and the ease with which it thinks it can find each of those. In order to try and overcome some of these problems, there are many approaches, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but effective behavior in this domain, because so much of the world is not known, requires fairly nuanced and forward-thinking reasoning, long horizon planning to jointly search, interact with objects, and actively gather task-relevant knowledge about the environment. Just as large language models are somewhat notoriously poor at math and numerical reasoning, we shouldn't necessarily expect them to be particularly good at determining which actions are of lowest expected cost for these complicated and open-ended problems with many multimodal solutions. So as a result, one of the things that I'm really interested in my lab is finding abstractions that jointly leverage the strategies or advantages of both these foundation models or learned models that can help us reason about what actions are reasonable, and in particular that help us reason about uncertainty, in particular in these planning under uncertainty tasks, while also still relying on planning for effective and reliable long horizon decision making. One of the things that I think is really interesting here, and we've talked about some of it or heard about some of it today, is this idea that you can rely on these generative models to produce for you certain skills, things like PDDL. You generate the PDDL, and then you can plan with this PDDL solver. However, I would like to remind people that there's a number of problems with this. One of them is that most of these don't necessarily output costs associated with a lot of these actions for PDDL, but it's also true that PDDL is not really well suited to plan when the environment is partially known. So we need some new abstractions that help us bridge this gap, in particular in this planning under uncertainty domain. So yes. So in order to understand where I come from in this particular problem space, I'd like to go back to some of the work I did a number of years ago now, not counting, but it's a little while. But still, I think a lot about point goal navigation as an excellent exemplar task for this domain. Just tell a robot, put a robot in an environment that's never been before, and say, you're here, I need you to get there, some goal that's maybe, tens, 100 meters away. How do you get there when the map is not known? As expected, optimistic planning isn't great at this. Optimistic planning treats unknown space as unoccupied and results in suboptimal behavior. The optimistic robot wrongly enters many classrooms, offices, and closets in an effort to try and get around the hallway to find a shortcut to the unseen goal. It doesn't really understand what the unseen space looks like, and so it makes generally poor decisions over and over and over again. As you might expect, these foundation models, these learned models can help bias the robot or inform some understanding of how the world works, of how the environment is structured, to try and bias the robot towards good behavior in these domains. So we use an abstraction where exploratory actions correspond to search beyond subgoals, each placed on frontiers, boundaries between free and unknown space. And in addition to just saying, here's a bunch of different ways that you can leave known space in an effort to make progress towards completing the objective, in this case, reaching the unseen point goal, we can also use some learned model or foundation model to make predictions about the likelihood of each one of these frontiers to lead us towards the destination that we seek. And so we make predictions about how likely or unlikely each one of these high-level exploratory actions is to reveal parts of the environment that we need in order to complete our objective. Now, it's not simply enough to pick the most likely frontier, at least that's a reasonable, greedy strategy to do, but instead, we would actually like to use this as a model-based planning abstraction, where we can actually take these frontiers and ask ourselves, how might we roll out potential outcomes of exploring each one of these environments, and then use that to do some sort of model-based planning. Planning with this abstraction, as you might expect, seeks to minimize expected cost, because we're planning under uncertainty here. We don't know the minimum cost, but we can evaluate this with respect to some expected distribution over the environment. The first thing that we might do in executing some action, A1, is to navigate to that boundary. Now, good news is that's a thing we know how to do. We can use some motion planner, we have some embodiment of the robot, we can know how to navigate to that boundary, and because we can use something like motion planning, we know exactly how long that's going to take, plus or minus some percentage points because of the physical embodiment of the robot may not be idealized. But once we get to that boundary, Our abstraction says that one of two high-level outcomes is possible. With some probability of success, the robot successfully navigates to the goal in unseen space and accumulates an expected cost of that successful trajectory. And with the inverse probability, it fails. It must explore that part of the environment and then be turned back upon realizing that it's a dead end. And because we use this in a non-greedy fashion, we actually continue to roll out what happens as the robot imagines executing these exploratory actions. If it fails to reach the goal from action number one, it must pick another and another and another. And the goal of planning is to find the sequence of exploratory actions that minimizes expected cost to complete this objective. As mentioned before, learning, and in some more recent work, we use things like foundation models to estimate these sub-goal properties, statistics of uncertainty that we have a very difficult time writing down. We learn them from experience, we use the common sense knowledge in some of these foundation models in order to try and tell us the goodness of each one of these actions, and then still rely on model-based planning to actually synthesize those into some best performing plan. This is our learning over sub-goals planning abstraction, at the core of which is this idea of learning-informed, long-horizon planning under uncertainty. Via this approach, we can dramatically outperform the optimistic baseline because the system is both biased by learning or guided by learning towards actions that are good at making progress towards the objective, but also capable of doing things like backtracking, reasoning about potential shortcuts. Sometimes it still enters these rooms where it thinks a shortcut may exist, and this is emergent behavior because we're actually sequencing these plans or sequencing these actions into some long-term plans. Now, planning via this approach is sound and complete. We're building a map of the environment, so the actions that we have for exploration are just actually building the map, and so we keep growing and growing our envelope of observability until we can complete our objective. The predictive model in particular, whether it be a foundation model or some model trained specifically for this purpose, is only making predictions about uncertainty. And when the world is fully known, it is not needed, which is a kind of advantage of this mode of thinking, because I don't want to necessarily offload computation to one of these foundation models unless I think that I need to for some reason, because we actually have an idea of how to navigate through known space. This key idea, the idea that we're augmenting planning with some foundation model or learned model for both performance and reliability. We have found that this core idea has enabled considerable progress in domains where neither classical models for planning that rely on things like PDDL nor foundation models or learning alone are able to afford good performance. The aim here is to develop a family of abstractions that facilitate the integration of learning with classical planning to augment this otherwise classical planning. The state and action abstractions provide reliability and flexibility, while the foundation models provide knowledge that they need in order to perform well. So now thinking back towards this breakfast preparation task, moving beyond just thinking about these point goal navigation tasks, you can see how this same idea can be applied to this scenario as well, where we have these exploratory actions that are added as necessary to reveal or probe unseen space in some capacity, where the costs and outcomes or outcome probabilities of associated with revealing some part of the environment are estimated with a learned model via or foundation model. Meanwhile, we have the standard set of known space actions. For things that we understand, that we have seen before, that we have revealed, we have these, let's say, PDDL operators that tell us how we can actually interact with those things. So this framework allows for effective planning under uncertainty and has enabled a host of capabilities, everything ranging from some work that is forthcoming in collaboration with my student Raihan Arnab, but also Max Merlin and George Kanadaris of Brown University. Robot demos are currently forthcoming, but in simulation we've shown some really promising performance where based on this approach, we can actually come up with plans that effectively interleave search and execution. They're reliable, they succeed nearly 100% of the time, with the only failures coming from timing out of the classical planning model, but the performance comes from the fact that we are using learning to guide the robot towards effectively revealing unseen space to help quickly make progress towards its overall objective. The robot, or the planner that the robot relies upon, is made uncertainty aware via our approach, and so knows both what objects it should seek out and when to look for them. By virtue of having this model-based approach, we can also take this same model and now apply it to a multi-body robot system, where we have centralized multi-robot coordination under uncertainty, where we can have these multiple robots that divide and conquer to explore unknown environments for the purposes of things like point goal navigation, or also kind of split up in order to complete some complicated multi-step objective as a team. This is currently some work in progress. We're in preparation on some of these things, but I'm happy to talk to anybody who's maybe interested in some of this stuff as well. And also, because we have a model, we could do all the things that you might want to do when you have a model. You can use this for counterfactual reasoning as well, to say my predictive model said that this was a good thing to do, but my experience in the world said that that actually didn't end up being a very good thing to do. And we can use this for the purposes of model selection or even prompt selection while the robot is deployed. We can use counterfactual reasoning to do this sort of model selection with bandit-like algorithm guarantees on asymptotic convergence for the best performing of a family of prompts or learned models, which is something we're really excited about. It's a whole area of research in my lab. Happy to talk about it more after this. Now, one thing I want to sort of interject here is another emerging area of research in my lab. This idea that planning under uncertainty is a thing that I care about a lot, but by no means the only way that we can interface between our classical approaches for model-based planning and this injection of learning to help bias the system towards good behavior. In fact, Tom was just talking about some of this style of work where typically when you're planning for a lot of these systems, you have this large null space of what successful plans look like, but you need some other wisdom or knowledge or understanding in order to bias you towards what good or common sense-like solutions might look like. So let's consider this task and motion planning scenario of cabinet loading that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And interestingly enough, despite the fact that it's not quite related to some of the work that Tom was talking about earlier, Tom and I are collaborators on this along with my colleague Shui-Su Zhao at George Mason University. But this idea that even when the state is fully known, classical planning can fall short in some key ways. We tell the robot to load the cabinet and it loads the cabinet. All right, I asked my students in my class to give me a continuously valued thumbs up. How do people feel about the loading of this cabinet? Good? Not very good. Did it succeed at the task? Yes, but it's not great, right? It did the thing, it loaded the bowls and the mugs, and it did so in a way that was actually quite low cost. The problem is that as soon as you then tell the robot to unload this cabinet, the environment persists between tasks, and so in order to unload the bowls, it needs to remove the mugs because they're obstructing the bowls in the back. And so this isn't great, not because the robot failed in any capacity on the immediate objective, but because in the real world, the environment persists, and we actually have these side effects that are inadvertently caused by poor choices made when completing the immediate objective. Instead, this idea that robots are problematically myopic and can seem intrusive and inefficient even when they succeed at completing their objective. Some of our approach, which I don't really have time to talk about here, is what we refer to as anticipatory planning, and in this case, anticipatory task and motion planning. The idea is that we have some foundation model or some learned model that estimates the expected future cost evaluated with respect to tasks the robot might be assigned but hasn't yet been given, which can help bias the robot towards completing the objective in a way that is future aware, that is forward thinking in a way that reduces overall cost by virtue of understanding how its environment is made better or worse by its choices along the way to completing its current objective. So by virtue of our anticipatory task and motion planning approach, the learning or the foundation model helps us anticipate these side effects and guide planning in order to improve overall performance. Under the hood, it's still a classical planner, it's still running a task and motion planning solver, but we're using this anticipatory planning heuristic to bias us towards solutions that minimize the joint immediate and expected future cost. So we do this on some physical system as well. I'm really interested in this idea of anticipatory planning because I think it might give rise to many common sense-like behaviors which are very difficult to write down in a cost-based formulation. I think a lot about planning. I think a lot about cost, as you can imagine from this talk. But I'm really interested in this idea that robots can be made tidy, their actions can prioritize organization and tidiness. Robots can be made more unobtrusive just by virtue of being given an understanding of how their actions impact the state of the environment and what that looks like. So my work generally aims to develop abstractions that integrate planning with learned models. I hope to augment rather than replace planning with learning to achieve good performance, but also maintain these guarantees on things like completeness, generality, and reliability. The core idea is that having a model to integrate learning and planning is key to achieving these capabilities, and foundation models are increasingly used for planning and becoming more and more reliable. I'm really interested in this idea of performance becoming the next frontier. As we start to get foundation models that are better and better at completing tasks, I think it's increasingly important we start thinking about how to make sure they do tasks well, and I think this is one potential strategy for doing that. So I hope that this work can serve as inspiration for those of you who may be interested in designing this next generation interface that sort of blends the gap between what we know works in planning and also what is useful and helpful from these foundation model systems. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody. I'll be around all week. Come say hi. I'm happy to talk about all this stuff. I'd like to thank my collaborators and funders, and with that, I can take maybe one question. But anyway, thanks a lot, everybody.
All right, thanks so much, Greg, for showing us how robot can use foundation model and learn model to plan under uncertainty.
Oh,
So
yeah.
maybe we'll take one quick question.
Hi, thanks for the nice talk.
Sure.
I have the question about common sense behavior, which you just talked right now.
Yeah.
I want to learn more about what are your thoughts about what are the possible ways in which you can make it more mathematically feasible way, which planners, other kind of models can use. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think I didn't have time to dive into some of the technical details associated with this particular approach, but this is the way, like, I strove to answer more or less that question, this particular approach. There's lots of things that we can use to define common sense behavior. Common sense reasoning is sort of canonically eludes precise definition, but I have a very specific definition of what I think is common sense in this context, and it's anticipation. It's this idea that there are going to be more tasks and more things that the robot needs to do next, and we can use some learned model or even just a ton of computation to try and evaluate the expected future cost of ending in a particular state and then giving the robot some task. And so framed in that light, this is a very mathematically heavy formulation of common sense. This is a way of saying I can predict or compute the expected cost associated with completing the task in that way versus that way, and then use that to say, well, that way is better, not because it's cheaper initially, but because it saves a lot of time when the robot needs to think about its longevity. You know, this idea that it must maintain or act as a constant steward of its environment over a long-lived operation. So I think that this is my way of trying to make precise this notion of common sense, and anything that looks like common sense that doesn't emerge from this, I say, is not that style of common sense. It's just a very broad category, but I think that this is some sliver of common sense and a great way of motivating a lot of behaviors I see as good behaviors in the context of task and motion planning. It's kind of circular logic. If it sounds like a tautology, it might be. So we could chat about it offline. I want to, give back the floor. So thank you. Give you the mic.
All right, thanks so much. Let's
Thanks,
get
everybody.
around the